Today, we are tackling something huge. We're looking at what was once hyped as the most ambitious global project in modern history, China's Belt and Road Initiative. It promised to literally reshape the world, but as you're about to see, the story took a very, very dramatic turn. Let's get into it.
And this quote right here, it just perfectly captures the whole story. When this thing launched, the world was in awe. I mean, project of the century. But a decade later, many of its partners are in financial ruins, and the project's reputation is in absolute tatters. So what on earth happened?
To really understand the fallout, we have to go back to the beginning, back to the original dream. We're talking 2013, when Chinese President Xi Jinping announced a plan so massive, so unbelievably ambitious, they called it the project of the century.
And the vision was, you have to admit, intoxicating. A grand plan to connect the entire world and bring prosperity to developing nations. And guess what? The world bought in, big time. Just look at this number. Over 150 countries, mostly from the developing world, either signed up or showed serious interest. They were all eager to be a part of this new era.
The mission, at least on paper, looked incredible. China was promising to build a modern-day Silk Road, this massive web of infrastructure linking entire continents. If you were a nation struggling to develop, this sounded like an absolute dream come true. Brand new ports, shiny new highways, and a direct path to economic growth. And for China? Well, it was a chance to establish itself as a true global leader.
And China put its money where its mouth was. We're talking over $1 trillion poured into this initiative. $1 trillion. Now, what's really fascinating about this staggering number is how the money was used. See, it wasn't given as aid or grants. This was cash offered as loans. And often these loans were going to poorer nations that had already been turned down by Western banks or the IMF, who saw them as way too risky. So for these countries, China looked like a savior. But pretty soon, critics started to argue that all this generosity came with a very steep, hidden cost. That beautiful dream of development started to look a lot more like a nightmare. And a new, sinister-sounding term entered the global conversation: debt trap diplomacy.
So what exactly is this accusation? What is debt trap diplomacy? Well, the theory goes that China wasn't just being generous by building infrastructure. The allegation is that it was intentionally burying countries in so much debt that they could never pay it back. And the goal? To gain political leverage and ultimately seize control of the very assets they had just built.
And here's how the strategy allegedly worked, kind of like a playbook. Step 1, offer an absolutely irresistible massive loan for a huge project. Step 2, attach a little condition. The project has to be built by Chinese companies using Chinese workers. This ensures that most of the money flows right back to China. And then, Step 3, the final checkmate. If the country can't pay back the loan, China takes control of the asset. Now, this wasn't just a theory floating around. People started seeing it happen in the real world. Let's take a look at some of the most shocking examples of these projects going completely off the rails. Okay, our first stop is Sri Lanka, and this is probably the most infamous case of all. China sold its leaders on this amazing vision of a brand new, bustling port at Hambantota that would one day rival Dubai. The only problem? All the feasibility studies showed it wasn't actually needed, but they built it anyway, borrowing $1.3 billion. The port, predictably, failed to attract ships. Unable to pay, Sri Lanka was forced to hand over the port to a Chinese state-owned company on a 99-year lease.
And if you think that's bad, it gets even more absurd. Right next to that failed port, Sri Lanka used another $200 million loan from China to build a massive international airport. Today, it's literally known as the world's emptiest airport. It gets so little traffic that people have spotted wild animals just wandering around on the runway. You can't make this stuff up.
Next, let's head over to Africa and look at Zambia. This nation, which is super reliant on copper exports, took on huge Chinese loans to try and modernize its economy. By 2020, that debt had gotten so big that China held almost half of it. So, when the pandemic hit and copper prices crashed, Zambia's economy just collapsed, making it the very first African nation to default during that whole era. This wasn't just happening far away. Over in Europe, the tiny nation of Montenegro borrowed $1 billion from China to build a highway. The project turned out to be so expensive that the money ran out after just 41 kilometers. I'm not kidding, the road literally just ends in the middle of a field. And that debt, it ballooned to over 80% of the country's entire GDP, pushing it right to the brink of bankruptcy.
And then in South America, you've got Ecuador. They borrowed billions for this huge hydro dam to solve their energy crisis. But then reports started coming out about shoddy construction and massive bribery. Today, the dam is riddled with over 17,000 cracks and is at serious risk of collapsing. It's a potential environmental and human catastrophe just waiting to happen.
And then there's Pakistan. The Gwadar port was supposed to be the crown jewel of the whole China-Pakistan partnership. But just look at this revenue split. According to the deal, for the next 40 years, China gets 91% of all the revenue. Pakistan, the country where the port is actually located, gets a measly 9%. It's just wild.
So as you can imagine, as all these stories of debt, default, and disaster started piling up, the rest of the world began to wise up. That initial excitement for the BRI started to turn sour, and countries began to push back.
This timeline really shows you how the tide shifted. Back in 2019, Italy shocked its allies and became the first and only G7 nation to join up. But just 4 years later, after seeing almost no economic benefit, Italy's prime minister publicly called it a big mistake and formally pulled out. And in the meantime, you see the US and the EU launching their own rival infrastructure programs, all promising to be more transparent.
And hey, Italy wasn't alone in getting cold feet. Malaysia went and canceled billions of dollars worth of BRI projects. Myanmar renegotiated the terms of a huge port deal. And other nations, like Bangladesh and Nepal, started looking at any new Chinese deals with a whole lot more caution. The message was loud and clear. The era of just blindly trusting these deals was over.
So facing this huge global backlash and this trail of very public, very expensive failed projects, China has been forced to completely rethink its strategy. So where does the whole Belt and Road thing stand today?
Well, China has pretty much launched what people are calling BRI 2.0. The new focus is all about smaller, smarter, and greener projects. So instead of these trillion-dollar mega projects, the new buzzwords are things like digital infrastructure and green energy. It's a really clear attempt to shake off that whole debt trap label and rebrand the initiative for a much more skeptical world.
So what's the final scorecard here? On the one hand, it's been a PR disaster for China's reputation. It's now stuck with the debt trap label and is on the hook for billions in bad loans. But on the other hand, you have to admit China has scored some major strategic wins. It now holds stakes in over 100 ports all around the globe, it's massively expanded its geopolitical influence, and it's successfully pushed its currency, the yuan, in global trade.
Which brings us to our final big question. Was the Belt and Road Initiative just the colossal trillion-dollar failure that crippled developing nations and totally backfired on Beijing? Or was it, despite all the costs, a calculated and brilliantly cunning strategy to acquire strategic assets and influence all across the globe? You know, the truth is, it was probably a little bit of both.